What if the moment everyone thought would never come has already happened? What if the most patient man in the room finally stood up, not to speak, but to act? And what if everything you thought you understood about silence, restraint, and royal weakness was completely wrong? For years, the world watched the same pattern repeat itself. Meghan Markle spoke. Prince Harry echoed. The media amplified. Social platforms debated. And the royal family did what they always seemed to do: nothing. No dramatic denials. No lawsuits. No public counterattacks. Just brief statements, if any at all, and then quiet. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. To many people, that quiet felt deafening. Commentators called it cowardice. Critics called it guilt. Supporters of the Sussexes called it proof. Proof that the accusations must have had weight. Otherwise, why wouldn't the palace respond? Why wouldn't they defend themselves? It's a fair question. And it's exactly the question the palace expected people to ask. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people never stop to consider. Powerful institutions don't behave like individuals. They don't react emotionally. They don't move quickly just to satisfy public curiosity. And they don't reveal their strategy while they're still building it. In the royal family's world, silence isn't absence. Silence is containment. Think about how unusual this situation actually is. A centuries-old monarchy, built on reputation, continuity, and symbolism, allowed its image to be challenged again and again on the world stage. Claims of mistreatment, allegations of cruelty, suggestions of institutional failure, all of it broadcast globally, often without rebuttal. Why would an institution that has survived wars, abdications, scandals, and revolutions choose to absorb that kind of reputational damage? Unless it believed responding too early would be a mistake. Unless it believed that every unchallenged word was adding weight to something far larger. This is where the story shifts from emotion to calculation. Because while the public was watching interviews and reading headlines, something else was happening quietly in the background. Not arguments, not family interventions, but records, timelines, transcripts, statements preserved exactly as spoken, exactly as published, exactly as distributed. Not to debate, to document. Ask yourself this. In any serious legal dispute, who benefits from speaking freely and often? And who benefits from saying almost nothing at all? Words feel powerful in the moment. They shape narratives. They move audiences. But in the long run, words are liabilities. Especially when they're inconsistent. Especially when they're emotional. Especially when they're public. Silence, on the other hand, doesn't contradict itself. For a long time, King Charles was portrayed as trapped. A father unable to control his son. A monarch unwilling to confront his daughter-in-law. A man paralyzed by fear of public backlash. That image stuck because it was easy. It fit the drama. It fit the headlines. But it may not have been accurate. Because weak leaders don't endure years of criticism if they believe action will strengthen them later. Weak leaders react impulsively. Strong ones wait until reaction becomes unnecessary. So why wait? Because timing matters more than outrage. Early on, any aggressive response could have been framed as bullying, as silencing, as abuse of power. Legal action at that stage might have played directly into the narrative being told. But time does something fascinating to stories. It exposes inconsistencies. It creates contradictions. It allows statements made years apart to be compared side by side. And it gives institutions space to assess something far more important than public opinion: risk. There is a difference between a damaging accusation and a legally actionable one. There is a difference between storytelling and statements that cross into territory where intent, accuracy, and consequence matter. And here's the part most people miss. Not every line is crossed loudly. Sometimes it's crossed quietly, buried in a podcast, or tucked into a memoir, or repeated casually because it sounded good the first time. Over time, those lines stack. They form patterns. And patterns are exactly what lawyers look for. Which brings us to the idea no one wants to confront. What if the royal family's restraint wasn't about mercy, but about leverage? What if the palace understood that responding emotionally would weaken them, but responding later, with preparation, would strengthen them? Because when you look at it through that lens, the last few years don't look like chaos. They look like accumulation. Every public appearance added another data point. Every retelling created another version of events. Every contradiction, however small, added friction between narrative and record. And then something changed. Not publicly, not dramatically, but decisively. Sources close to royal legal circles have hinted at a shift in posture, a movement from observation to evaluation, from tolerance to boundary setting. And once that shift happens, it rarely reverses. This is the moment where people ask the wrong question. They ask, what did Meghan say that finally crossed the line? But the better question is, what did the palace decide it could no longer afford to ignore? Because this isn't just about one person or one family feud. This is about institutional credibility, about whether the monarchy allows its legacy to be shaped entirely by external voices, about whether future generations inherit an unchallenged version of events simply because no one wanted to escalate. At some point, in any institution, restraint becomes complicity, and that's a dangerous place to be. King Charles inherited a monarchy already under pressure. Modern skepticism, social media scrutiny, declining deference. He didn't create those problems, but he inherited the responsibility to manage them. And one of the hardest decisions any leader faces is knowing when patience stops being a virtue. This is where the personal and the institutional collide. As a father, Charles may have hoped for reconciliation, for cooling emotions, for time to heal wounds. But as a king, he has a duty that extends beyond his family. He is responsible for protecting the integrity of the crown itself. Those two roles don't always align, and when they don't, something has to give. So imagine the moment when advisors stop asking how to calm the situation and start asking how to contain it. When legal teams stop monitoring and start modeling outcomes. When the conversation shifts from public perception to legal exposure. That's not a moment of anger. That's a moment of finality. Because once an institution like the monarchy decides to assert itself legally, it's no longer about feelings. It's about thresholds. About whether certain claims, repeated often enough and widely enough, create measurable harm. About whether silence now poses a greater risk than action. And that brings us to the most chilling realization of all. This may not be about punishment. It may be about precedent. About drawing a line so firm that no one, royal or not, mistakes silence for permission ever again. If that's the case, then what's unfolding isn't reactive. It's corrective. And corrective actions don't aim to soothe. They aim to stop. So when people say, why now? They may be missing the point. Now is when the record is complete. Now is when the narratives have stabilized. Now is when the institution believes it understands the terrain well enough to move without losing control. And once that decision is made, there's no return to quiet. Because the silence that once protected everyone has reached its limit. And when silence ends, it doesn't end with a whisper. It ends with something far more serious. But the most shocking part of this story isn't that King Charles may be ready to act. It's what allegedly triggered that readiness. Because according to those watching closely, there was a moment, a shift, a realization that whatever this conflict once was, it no longer could be contained privately. And once that realization set in, the strategy changed. The waiting stopped. The patience ended. And the next phase began. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if everything you thought was weakness was actually preparation? What if the quiet wasn't confusion, fear, or paralysis, but discipline? Because the moment the palace stopped speaking publicly wasn't the moment it gave up. It may have been the moment it started keeping score. For years, people asked the same question over and over again. Why didn't the royal family respond? Why didn't they correct the record? Why didn't they defend themselves when accusations went viral, when reputations were questioned, when history itself seemed to be rewritten in real time? And maybe you asked that question too, because silence feels unnatural in a world addicted to response. In today's media culture, whoever speaks loudest feels like the winner. Whoever responds fastest controls the narrative. Whoever stays quiet looks guilty. But that logic applies to individuals, influencers, celebrities, not institutions that think in decades. Here's the first uncomfortable truth you need to sit with. The British monarchy does not see time the way the public does. What feels like too long to us can feel like just enough to them. And what feels like humiliation in the short term can look like leverage in the long term. So let's rewind. When Meghan Markle and Prince Harry stepped back from royal duties, the story was framed as liberation. freedom from protocol, freedom from constraint, freedom from what they described as a toxic environment. And at first, the palace responded cautiously. Carefully worded statements, diplomatic language, nothing confrontational. Then came the interviews, then the podcasts, then the docuseries, then the memoir. With each new appearance, the tone sharpened. Claims became more specific, emotions more vivid, details more confident. And still, the palace largely said nothing. To the public, it felt maddening. Why let accusations sit unanswered? Why allow one side to dominate the conversation? Why absorb hit after hit without throwing a single punch? Because sometimes the smartest move in a public brawl is to leave the ring entirely. Think about how legal conflicts actually work. In court, the person who talks the most rarely wins. The person who talks the least often knows exactly what they're doing. Every word spoken publicly becomes a data point. Every claim can be cross-referenced. Every contradiction can be logged. And silence? Silence can't be impeached. While the Sussexes spoke to millions, the palace listened. While audiences reacted emotionally, advisors analyzed structurally. While the internet argued about feelings, lawyers thought about thresholds. This wasn't about winning hearts in the moment. It was about protecting the institution in the long run. And here's the contradiction no one likes to admit. The more one side spoke, the stronger the other side potentially became, without lifting a finger. Because public storytelling feels powerful. It feels cathartic. It feels like control. But storytelling also creates records. And records are dangerous if you don't control them perfectly. Ask yourself this. How many times can one story be told before the details shift? How many retellings before memory and narrative drift apart? How many interviews before emotion replaces precision? That's not an insult. It's human nature. But human nature is exactly what legal strategies are built around. Behind palace walls, silence didn't mean inactivity. It meant observation, cataloging, archiving. Not just what was said, but when it was said. Not just the claims, but the context. Not just the accusations, but how they evolved over time. And evolution matters. Because an accusation told once is a grievance. An accusation repeated, refined, and amplified over years becomes something else entirely. Especially when it starts to affect third parties. Especially when it shapes public belief. Especially when it becomes part of the historical record. This is where the palace's patience starts to look less like passivity and more like positioning. Early legal action would have been risky. It could have validated the narrative of oppression. It could have been framed as silencing. It could have turned a personal dispute into a global spectacle with unclear outcomes. Waiting, however, allowed something crucial to happen. Patterns emerged. And patterns are gold in any serious assessment. Statements made years apart could now be compared side by side. Claims that once seemed isolated could be viewed cumulatively. Emotional recollections could be weighed against documented timelines. And perhaps most importantly, the palace could observe how far the narrative was willing to go. Was it just personal pain being shared? Or was it crossing into territory where institutions, reputations, and constitutional roles were being directly challenged? That distinction matters more than you might think. Because the monarchy isn't just a family. It's a legal entity, a constitutional fixture, an institution whose actions and inactions carry consequences far beyond personal relationships. At some point, the question shifts. It stops being, is this hurtful? And becomes, is this harmful? Harm isn't measured in feelings. It's measured in impact. Impact on public trust, on diplomatic relationships, on institutional legitimacy, on the perception of fairness, stability, and continuity. And once harm becomes measurable, silence becomes risky. This is where King Charles enters the story not as a father, but as a monarch. As a prince, Charles had lived through scandal. He had endured criticism. He had learned the cost of reacting too quickly and the benefit of waiting things out. As a king, however, his responsibilities changed. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting the crown. And protecting the crown sometimes means doing the opposite of what feels compassionate in the moment. Sources familiar with royal decision-making have long said that Charles is not impulsive. He is methodical, reflective, often frustratingly slow. But slowness can be an asset when the goal is to outlast chaos rather than defeat it outright. So imagine the internal conversations over the years. Not dramatic shouting matches. Not emotional confrontations. But quiet reviews. Careful assessments. Advisors asking questions like, what happens if we never respond? What happens if we respond too soon? What happens if this narrative becomes permanent? Those are not questions asked lightly. And here's where the silence becomes strategic in a way most people don't appreciate. By not responding, the palace avoided creating a two-sided public war. It allowed the narrative to exist largely uncontested, which paradoxically made it easier to analyze objectively. Without public rebuttals muddying the waters, statements stood on their own. They couldn't be blamed on provocation. They couldn't be reframed as reactive. They simply existed.